Hello, Star Trek fans, and welcome to the Rebinge Deep Space Nine podcast. My name is Kim.
And my name is James.
And my name's Attiba.
And we're watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine from the beginning, one episode at a time. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are on Season 6, episode lucky number 13, Far Beyond the Stars. This episode aired February 11th, 1998. This week, we welcome back our occasional guest star, Attiba Royster. Welcome, Attiba.
Thank you. A star. Wow. Nice.
I was going to say host, but why not be a star?
Why not?
There's nothing to stop us from saying you're a guest star.
Nobody that can disprove it.
That's right. Is there any particular reason that you selected this as one of the episodes you wanted to watch?
Well, if you know the episode and if you are familiar with anything else that I've done, and if you know that I am African American, you might understand why I might find this particular episode to be very poignant. So,
sure, that makes sense. And normally you pick the two-parters, and this one could have been a two-parter. It felt like they cut it short.
Yeah.
But okay, that makes sense. Well, before we start talking about this particular one, is there anything to say about last week's episode? Which, Attiba, you haven't been able to hear the pod yet, but the episode was Who Mourns for Morn? Anything, any comments about that episode?
I'm sure you both loved it.
And in true Deep Space Nine whiplash fashion, we go from that episode to this episode. I mean, could the two be farther apart?
I don't think so.
I think, especially in the later seasons, they really try to sprinkle in some lighthearted episodes. And whiplash is probably the right word because there's such a dramatic change in tone between certain episodes in the latter seasons that can be quite a bit jarring.
Well, even in this season, we had a Sacrifice of Angels, which is an incredibly intense episode as they retake the station, and then it was followed by the Klingon wedding episode. At least it wasn't goofy, that episode, but it was certainly a change of pace.
Well, and then you had the Augments episode, which, as you described, was this pulled from season 1?
Statistical probabilities. That was bad. Not memorable. At least it wasn't memorable for good things.
Yeah.
Well, one last thing I want to note is there is some language in this episode that I don't intend to repeat when doing the walkthrough. It contains Star Trek's only use of a highly derogatory term, which I will not say. But there are also some other terms used to refer to African Americans that maybe were more fitting for the 1950 setting of the episode, but I see no reason to repeat any of those things here. If you have a deep need for completeness, then I encourage you to watch the episode yourself, which you should do anyway. I mean, what are you doing here if you're not watching the show or haven't already watched it? Anyone else have any pre-pod comments, or are we ready to get started?
Ready to go.
I am ready to go.
Well, we open in Sisko's office where Major Kira is telling the captain the Defiant found no survivors of the ship the Cortez, which was destroyed by Jem'Hadar fighters. Sisko is upset because the captain was a friend of his, and he complains that everyone thought the war was over when they took the station back, but now 400 more people are dead. Kira now exits and Grandpa Joe enters. He's been visiting the station, which was a surprise to me, and Kira asks what he thinks of the station, and he says, well, pause, it's big.
Not a ringing endorsement.
I thought that was funny.
It is nice, though, that Joe is on the station, because as it's a Bajoran station, he can actually go there, because he's been banned from Starfleet property since 2293.
Oh.
He went by the name Cartwright then.
You're so stuck on that. What movie was that?
It was Star Trek 6. We'll get round to it when we do our rebinges of the movies. We'll get round to that.
It was a long time ago. Well, Sisko apologizes to his dad for being bad company, but Grandpa Joe is worried he's carrying the weight of the Alpha Quadrant on his shoulders. Sisko says he doesn't know how much more he can take and how many more friends he can lose. He wonders if it's time to step down. Grandpa Joe says he'll support whatever decision he makes because he's a great father, but he encourages his son to do some thinking. Just then, Sisko sees Odo outside of the window of his office, only it's not Odo, it's Rene Aubergenois in an old-time suit and hat, and he pauses looking in the window, then keeps walking, shaking his head, and Sisko rushes out of his office asking, where did he go? But no one saw this person.
No.
And then we awkwardly jump here from Sisko seeing things to him walking in a hallway with his girlfriend Kasidy, who we haven't seen in a very long time.
Yep.
It seems that Sisko is trying to encourage her to be more careful when she's flying around doing whatever it is that she does. But Kasidy says she's fearless, and that's why Sisko loves her. And now we see Worf, or rather Michael Dorn, without his Klingon makeup, in an old-time Giants baseball uniform, saying, "Hey, Benny, you catch the game?" And Sisko says, "What?" as he walks by him.
Yeah.
And Kasidy doesn't see this, of course, and Sisko follows this human version of Worf through a door, and he walks into a very busy street in the past, where he is immediately hit by a taxi. Several people descend on him, and we hear someone say, "Call an ambulance." And now Sisko wakes up to Bashir flashing a super annoying light in his eyes. Grandpa Joe, Kasidy, and Jake are happy that Sisko's awake, but Bashir says he's reading some unusual synaptic potentials, just like those from the episode Rapture, where Sisko was experiencing visions about Bajor.
Oh, such a good episode.
That was one of our favorites. Bashir asks him to remain here overnight for observation. And then in a very awkward cut, we jump back to the old-time street that Sisko was just in, and we find him in a beautiful gray suit and hat and glasses, standing at a street corner newsstand, looking at a small magazine called Galaxy. And a newsboy asks him if he's going to buy it. And this character is played by Aaron Eisenberg, who plays Nog. And he looks a heck of a lot better out of makeup than in. And I say this only because I wouldn't say that's true about everyone in this episode. He tells this version of Sisko, who is not Sisko, by the way, that he doesn't know why anyone reads that magazine because it's all about spaceships and men from Mars. He prefers war stories. And then Miles, who isn't Miles, approaches, and we find that Sisko's name in this world is Benny, and Miles is Albert. And Miles/Albert is smoking a pipe, and we see he's a little quirky. He can't quite finish his own sentences, but he and Benny are going to walk to work together.
And we go into the opening credits. Okay, I love this opening. Avery totally got me with this opening, where he's lamenting the progress of the war and sort of emoting about how he's losing friends, about how all of this feels on his shoulders. That is such a good scene. That's another one of those scenes where Avery literally brings Sisko to life.
Yeah, and Avery Brooks directed this episode, and what we've seen from other episodes that he's directed is Sisko is usually not the main focus of the episode when he's directing, so this is a little bit different for sure. But yeah, I liked him talking to his father about it, that, you know, he's just feels like he's at a breaking point.
Right. I'll also defend the cutting. I think the editing in this episode is just so on point. That's a fantastic cut. Bashir handing him the pad and it turning into the magazine cover where he's in September 1953. That is a great transition. I'll agree maybe the one with Kasidy was maybe a time cut, was a little bit more aggressive, but the cuts that they make, I think, work really well.
I think it felt awkward because he was conscious.
Yeah.
And then he flipped over to that. Later, he's like waking up, but you didn't see him going to sleep. And it just felt awkward to me in that moment.
Yeah.
But we cut back and forth quite a bit, especially later when he's seeing himself on the station. Now we see a very smoggy New York City in the 50s, and we enter an office where we meet Major Kira, though not Major Kira, and Bashir, though not Bashir, both looking pretty glamorous in their 1950s costumes and hair. And we see another guy walking around the room in a suit who is Quark, but not Quark, played, of course, by Armin Shimmerman without makeup. Quark, who in this reality is known as Herb, shouts for Pabst, which is a terrible name to say, but Pabst is Odo. And Herb is complaining about the donuts being stale and threatens to quit. And they get into a big debate about donuts. And we learn that Herb is paid 4 cents a word for his writing, which seems to shock the Bashir character. And we're just establishing our characters here. And for the most part, these people never leave this one room. They are right here in this room for the rest of the episode.
Quick question. So you said that there are some people that look better out of makeup?
Yeah.
Shimmerman or Auberginois, are they better or worse out of makeup?
I think they're a little bit worse. In particular, I think maybe Shimmerman does not look great in this episode. I don't know. I suppose because it's just so jarring how different he looks. And also the character is so different from what he plays.
He is unconventionally attractive.
Sure. Yeah, you can say that.
And I have one more question, and this goes to James.
Yes.
What is the accent that Alexander Siddig is going for here? What is happening? Is that...
It is all over the place.
Okay. It makes me think the character that Bashir's playing is trying to pretend he's from a more aristocratic or British upper class background.
Yeah.
But the reality is, that probably isn't true. So that's why his accent, I think, is all over the place.
Right. So he's pretending to have an accent. He's playing a character that has an accent that's pretending to have a different accent.
Yes, exactly.
Nice. Okay. Got it.
He's pretending to be posh.
Yeah, basically, yes.
Well, now here's the scariest part, which is the next person who's going to appear. When Pabst/Odo says it's time to hand out next month's story assignments, and he calls for Roy Ritterhouse, who comes out of an office with a bunch of drawings. And this guy sounds mysteriously like Martok.
I love his look.
Not only without makeup, but he has 2 eyes. It's very jarring.
I don't know. I love JG Hertzler in this. Like, he's in like 2 scenes and they're both magical. I can't.
It's so jarring, I think, because his voice.
Yes.
His voice is so memorable. And I don't know that I've seen him as anything else except for Martog. So it's so funny to hear that voice coming out of the face when it's just a human face and not a Klingon.
Oh, exactly.
Well, Kira takes one of the pictures. Herb/Quark takes one with a sexy woman and an alien. So he's just really playing Quark in the 50s, where honestly, I think Quark would be quite comfortable. And then Martok Roy holds up a drawing that looks an awful lot like Deep Space Nine. Not exactly, but very close. And this one gets Benny's attention, and he takes that one. Pabst/Odo says the publisher, Mr. Stone, has decided to run a picture of the writers in next month's issue. A few caveats, though. No women, and whites only. I like Kira's little dig here when she says, God forbid the public finds out that Casey Hunter is a woman, which is maybe a nod to Star Trek writer DC Fontana, who wrote on the original series and Next Gen, and wrote the script for the DS9 episode Dax, which is from the first season. I think she did this exact same thing, which was to use her initials so that people wouldn't know when they saw her name that she was a woman.
Right.
Odo/Pabst makes some excuses that the world just isn't ready for a black writer. This irks everyone else in the room, and Benny starts listing off other black writers. Pabst says, yeah, but that's literature for liberals and intellectuals, not for the average reader.
Oh, dear.
Or perhaps he should have said, not for the average racist.
It's funny that Herb is the one who seems to complain the most about the societal bigotry.
Yes.
It's an inverse of Quark in some ways.
Yeah. Well, Odo says he wishes things were different, and Benny says wishing never changed a damn thing, which is perhaps the overarching theme here. Later that night, we see Benny exiting the office, and while locking up, his space station picture gets caught in the wind, and he has to chase after it. And now we see 2 more people, Marc Alaimo and Jeffrey Combs, also out of makeup and in dark suits and hats. And they catch the photo and start harassing Benny. Turns out they're cops, and they want to know how a black guy affords such a nice suit. Alaimo's character threatens to take him in and check him for priors, but Combs gives him the drawing back and tells him to just move on. And then Ducat's character says, the whole city is going to hell in a handbasket.
It's a damn shame.
Famously, I've seen Jeffrey Combs out of makeup, but I think this episode is the first time I've ever seen Marc Alaimo out of makeup. And I think I like Ducat.
He looks better as Ducat.
Well, I remember Marc Alaimo as the Martian military officer from Total Recall.
I don't remember him from that.
Right. That's a nice pull. Yes. He's in a blink and you'll miss it role in Total Recall.
Well, now we bump into Grandpa Joe, who appears to be a preacher quoting some scripture, and he says, the prophets shall send an angel to show his servants what must soon take place. And he points at Benny just as he walks by, getting his attention. And Preacher Joe says, write those words, Brother Benny. Let them see the glory of what lies ahead. And Benny is surprised that this guy even knows his name.
Yeah.
Joe just says, go and write the words that will set them free. It's very mysterious.
Oh, he also says, praise to the words of the prophets.
He's a great choice for this. Obviously, they could have used other characters from the show, but I thought this was a very good choice. Now Benny gets to his apartment where he sits at his typewriter and starts to write. He types, Captain Benjamin Sisko sat looking out the window. And then when Benny looks out of his own window, he sees the reflection of Sisko in his uniform rather than his own reflection.
Yes, what a great touch.
And he shakes it off and continues typing. The next morning, Benny enters a diner and we meet Kasidy as a diner waitress. And Benny says he's just written the best story of his life. Kasidy, who's known as Cassie in this story, wants them to buy this diner and run it together. She doesn't think writing is bringing in enough money to live on. And then in comes Michael Dorn as a human again, now in a beautiful red suit, by the way, and gray hat, looking good. It seems he is a famous baseball player named Willie who plays for the Giants, and he has his eye on Cassie, although she prefers Benny.
I think Michael Dorn just rocks it as a baseball player.
There were a couple of guys named Willie who played for the Giants, but in San Francisco, I think not in New York.
I just want to point out, this scene and the scene that precedes it with them all in the writing office just, for me, highlights just how well this cast is at playing off of each other.
Yeah.
Like, I would watch these actors read the phone book. Like, it's part of it is probably having worked with each other for 6-7 years.
Yeah.
But they just have a comfort level and familiarity and knowledge of each other that just makes them, like, whatever situation they're in or whatever the roles may demand, like, just makes them really enjoyable to watch.
Oh, agreed.
In my opinion.
I think that's something that definitely was not true in season 1. So I think they built up that rapport over time, and you can definitely see it. We've praised a lot of really good performances, and we've picked on a few not so great performances from at least one person in the usual cast. But yeah, overall, they definitely have gotten to the point where they work really well together.
And I wonder if some of that also comes down to the fact it's being directed by Avery. He's probably very aware of the strengths and the weaknesses of the people he works with and can basically set the focus around the stronger characters or the stronger actors.
Could be. That might explain why Bashir has hardly any lines.
I didn't go there.
Well, but I mean, it was your idea. So Cassie asks why a famous ball player, who is Willie/Worf, is still living in this neighborhood, and Willie says they can get used to me playing ball with them, but they don't want me as their neighbor. Besides, he likes being a big star in this neighborhood, and we see a bunch of women swarm him.
Oh, and the kids wanting autographs.
Yeah.
What year was baseball integrated?
46.
Oh, so they didn't have to say he was a Cuban.
Well, now in comes Jake in a weedy little mustache, which was very funny. And he is Jimmy, and he seems to be running some scams, like trying to sell a watch that he claims to have found. Benny tells him to get a real job, but he likes setting his own hours. And Jake/Jimmy makes fun of Benny for writing about a bunch of white people on the moon. But Benny says his latest story is different, and Jimmy, he doesn't really care.
Jimmy's a guy at the moment.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know what you're going to... I wish Cyril Lofton could play a character that was more like this. He feels more comfortable playing this kind of character than playing Jake Sisko.
He does seem very comfortable in this character, yeah. I would agree. Now we go to the writer's office, and everyone is reading Benny's story by passing the pages to each other one at a time. I thought that was really interesting. Meanwhile, Miles is playing the bongos while they're doing this, and we finally see Dax, who is very excited about a character with a worm in her belly. She says, that's interesting, but disgusting, but interesting.
Darlene Kursky.
This is Darlene, Pabst's new secretary, and Terry Farrell is laying it on quite thick with this character. I think she's getting the most out of her few seconds on screen.
Agreed.
They all seem very impressed with Benny's story. Quark/Herb says, Deep Space Nine is a very intriguing title and a fine piece of writing. And now for just a split second, Benny sees Major Kira in her uniform. And she says she likes the character of the Major. She's a tough cookie. And Martog, sitting at another table, likes the Cardassians, and he's excited to be able to draw them. So he heads out. Pabst comes out of his office telling everyone to get back to work. He can't print Benny's story because the captain is black. He says people won't accept it. It's just not believable. When Benny protests, Pabst says he's not a crusader. He's not here to change the world. He's an editor who just needs to get out a magazine that people will read. That type of racism is almost worse than the blatant racist, like, it's not me, it's society. And then they just hide behind everything. He says this book could even cause a race riot. Herb criticizes him for rationalizing his personal cowardice. And meanwhile, in the background, Dax just keeps putting one stick of gum in her mouth after another. I thought that was pretty funny. When Herb gets all mad at Odo or Pabst for insinuating that he's a communist, Bashir tells him to calm down. He says, "Calm down, dear boy. We're writers, not Vikings." It was a weird but very funny line.
Yes.
And Pabst tells him he can burn his story or stick it in a drawer for 50 years until people become colorblind, which I'm not sure 50 years is long enough. He says he'd print it if the captain was white.
Does this not famously kind of coincide with, this might be anecdotal, but apparently one of the main changes from the original version of the original series, which featured Majel Barrett as the first officer of the Enterprise.
Yeah.
One of the changes was no one's going to believe that a woman is going to be second in command of the Enterprise. So that was changed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no one would ever believe it. It's impossible. We go back to the diner and Jake/Jimmy says they aren't going to let black people into space unless they need someone to shine their shoes. And Jake has another really cute hat on in this scene. So yeah, he's very stylish. I think you're right. He's very comfy in this role. Benny says, but things have to change. Cassie implies that this is proof that Benny should quit his job and go into the diner business. And now a hand that looks like a Klingon grabs Benny's shoulder, and we see Worf, looking like a Klingon, asking if he heard the game last night. When Benny sees Worf, he sort of freaks out and he falls to the floor. But then he says he just needs air and he rushes out, and we see Worf back in human form.
Yeah.
So it's all starting to merge together, I think, in his mind. Out in the dark street, Benny bumps into Preacher Joe again, who says to follow the path of the prophets, Brother Benny. Show us the way. He says, write the words that will lead us out of the darkness. And Benny is like, I don't know what you're talking about, and runs back to his typewriter to keep working on his story. A few hours later, Cassie wakes Benny up. He's fallen asleep working on his story. She doesn't know why he's even writing it if he can't sell it, but he says he has to write it. She asks him for a dance before she leaves, and as they dance, he starts to flash between the station and the apartment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Cassie shifts to Kasidy and then back to Cassie, but when she's Kasidy, she says something about the Dominion War, which confuses Benny, and he starts to panic, saying he might be losing his mind. He says he's seeing things from his story, and he's turning into Captain Sisko. And Cassie says, oh, you just need some rest.
This is another really well put together scene. The way they're doing the flashing between Kasidy and Cassie and the station and the apartment, it's really quite disturbing. And it's beautifully done.
Back to the office, and Pabst is annoyed that Benny has written 6 more Deep Space Nine stories with the Black Captain. He says, have you lost your mind? And Benny isn't sure. He thinks he might be. Bashir suggests self-printing, though Casey/Kira says you might as well write it in chalk on the sidewalk. Miles, though, suggests making the end of the story a dream. And Casey/Kira says the dreamer could be someone without much hope, like a shoeshine boy or a convict. Benny thinks that's a better idea than chalk on a sidewalk.
Yeah, and Pabst seems to agree to this plan.
He does.
Also, there seems to be some debate as to whether this enhances or tears out any of the meaning of the story. I'm just curious if either of you have an opinion as to whether making the story a dream would enhance or detract from its overall impact.
If he was making a statement about equality, it would almost certainly detract from it. If it is just, I need to get it published, and it's the only way to do it, but the story still works, maybe it's acceptable. It comes down to the argument of, is getting the story out there as important as the principle of the story?
That is important. Also, if the author's intent was for the story to be aspirational, I think that changes what the impact would be. But just an interesting little diversion.
I think it could be impactful either way. When it's a dream, it has more of a, but this is what could be kind of aspect to it, and something that somebody is believing in and reaching for. That could have its own impact. And if it's not a dream, then it's like you're just normalizing it, and that has a different kind of impact. So I think it could work either way, depending upon how it's written. If you make it a dream, you're almost giving people this option that they can just say, oh, it's meaningless, it's just a dream. That maybe can take away from it, but I think those people you're probably not reaching anyway.
Right.
Good point.
Now out in the street, Benny is on cloud 9 as he runs into Jimmy, who seems distracted and isn't really listening. Jimmy says he's got some big-time business to take care of. It's like, okay, man. In the diner, human Worf, who is in a third nice suit in this episode, he's the only one who gets to keep changing clothes. That makes me laugh. He's describing his latest home run to Cassie when Benny comes running in to say his Sisko story is going to be published at 3 cents a word, and tonight we're all celebrating. Now it's evening, and Cassie and Benny are coming out of a nightclub, and they both look absolutely gorgeous. Cassie is wearing a red dress, Benny is in a gray suit with a bright pink shirt, and he's so happy that he starts singing. That was a shocker. When Preacher Joe sort of creepily emerges from a dark corner, and he says, Brother Benny, this is only the beginning of your journey, not the ending, and the path of the prophet sometimes leads to darkness and pain. He says, I speak with the voice of the prophets, and puts his hand on Benny's ear, and when he pulls his hand back, there's blood on his fingertips. So Benny grabs his own ear, but finds no blood.
Yeah, and Preacher Joe says, hope and despair walk arm in arm.
Yeah, and then he really dramatically backs into the darkness and sort of disappears.
Okay, like, that's not really troubling.
It's very creepy.
The prophets are such jerks, you guys.
They really are.
You can't just say outright what you need the guy to do. No, he has to do all these trials and tribulations. Just say, hey, get us a sandwich.
We talked about that in The Sacrifice of Angels, when they're just like, oh, you can't do that. You have to keep playing the game. And we're like, can you maybe just tell him what you want rather than doing this? This doesn't make any sense.
It's perfectly in line with the prophets.
Yeah, it's consistent. Well, now we hear gunfire, and Benny runs to the sound, which, by the way, you shouldn't run to the sound of gunfire. You should run the other direction. And he finds Dukat and Wayoon, and they've shot and killed Jimmy, who was breaking into a car with a crowbar. I guess that was his big business. They say he was armed with that crowbar, and Benny gets into a fist fight with the 2 cops, who just start beating the absolute life out of him, while Cassie screams for them to stop. Now we jump to several weeks later, and Benny is recovering from the beating. Cassie convinces him to go to the office because today is the day his first Sisko story is going to be published. She asks if he's having any more hallucinations, and he says, not convincingly, I'm fine. And she puts on his glasses, gives him a cane, and kisses him goodbye. We go to the office, and everyone watches Benny limp in. They're all waiting for Paps to return from the printer with the new edition. They heard what happened to Benny, and Benny just says he's okay. And Miles/Albert has sold his novel. At least they're all happy about that, and they congratulate him before Odo enters with the bad news. So it turns out the publisher has pulled this month's edition and had it destroyed. He apparently didn't like it. Benny starts to get a little frantic, asking why. He's like, was it the artwork or the layout, or was it because the hero was black? And Pap says the publisher can do what he wants. Pap says it's not about what's right, it's about what is. And Mr. Stone has also decided to fire Benny. And this sends Benny over the edge. He says, you can't fire me, I quit. To hell with you and Stone. And he knocks everything off the table in front of him using his cane. Odo says he'll call the police if he doesn't calm down. But Benny is tired of being calm. None of you can do anything to me anymore. Through ragged, sort of frantic breathing, he says, I'm a human being. You can deny me all you want, but you can't deny that Ben Sisko and that future exists because I created it and it exists in my mind. You can't destroy an idea. It's real. And then he starts to cry as he falls to the ground, shouting, it's real. And Casey and Herb are the first ones to jump in and try to help him.
Wow, what a scene.
That was intense.
A very intense scene, yes.
Yeah.
Now we see Benny being wheeled out to an ambulance on a stretcher. His colleagues and a small, gathered crowd look on as he's lifted into the ambulance and driven away. In the ambulance, Benny wakes up and he puts on his glasses, and now he's wearing Sisko's uniform, and Preacher Joe is sitting next to him. And he says, rest easy, Brother Benny. You have walked in the path of the prophets. There is no greater glory. And Benny asks, who am I? And Joe says, don't you know? You're the dreamer and the dream. And now we go to the station where Sisko wakes up with everyone staring at him. And Bashir says he was only out for a few minutes, but his neural patterns have returned to normal. This is good news, but he can't explain it. Later in Sisko's quarters, Grandpa Joe comes in to check on his son. He's leaving in the morning because his restaurant customers are missing him. And he asks what Sisko is going to do. And Sisko says, the only thing I can do, stay here and finish the job I started. And if I fail, and then Grandpa Joe finishes the sentence with, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Sisko is surprised to hear him quote the Bible, and Grandpa Joe says, I'm full of surprises. He asks if the dream helped Sisko sort things out, but Sisko is wondering if maybe it wasn't a dream. What if this life we're leading is the illusion? Maybe, just maybe, Benny isn't the dream we are, and we're just figments of his imagination. For all we know, somewhere far beyond all those distant stars, Benny Russell is dreaming of us. And then he sees the reflection of Benny in the window. The end.
Wow. That was quite an impressive ending.
I did like that ending. I really like that line, you're the dreamer and the dream. I have a feeling we're going to find out what that means eventually. But all right, over-analysis. Who wants to go first?
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Well, firstly, going back to Attiba's point, couldn't they just try telling a corporeal what was on their minds instead of putting them through some kind of trial by narrative?
Apparently not. They're never clear about anything, right? I think it was Resurrection where Kira said, yeah, nobody really understands what they're telling us.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Oh, you guys aren't there yet. I can't mention.
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
Okay.
You'll get kicked off this podcast forever.
Oh, yes, the prophets are jerks.
The next thing, I very much got the vibe for the production quality of this being very much in line with The Devil in a Blue Dress, the movie with
Denzel Washington.
Yes, exactly.
Jennifer Beals. Yeah. It's a detective story set in 50s Los Angeles, but primarily dealing with the Black community. So
that was a long time ago when I saw that. I would agree is a high production quality in this episode. The scenes where they're in the 50s felt very realistic.
Yeah.
Maybe even a little bit more than what they've managed to do with the space station.
It's really interesting. I actually wanted to look in and do a little research and see if someone happened to be shooting something in the 50s at the same time, because they got all this together very quickly.
Yeah.
Especially what we know about how those shows are produced. So yes, the production value, if they did pull it all together in the time that it would have taken them to do so, is very impressive.
It's very hard for me to do a lot of research because every time I try, I get a spoiler of something. So I try to stay away from that, but I do think that's an interesting question. What else you got, James?
And that, shockingly, is probably the end of my overanalysis.
Really?
Wow.
Okay. How about you, Attiba? What do you have?
As far as overanalysis goes, I don't have anything to say specifically about the nuts and bolts of how this episode went. I have more to say about thematically and what this episode means more personally and I think for the franchise at large. Mm-hmm. But structurally, I don't really have a lot of issues. I would like to point out that this seems to be the only universe where good things happen to Miles O'Brien. So that's nice.
That's a good point.
He had a limp and was walking with a cane. So at least one thing bad.
But he got his novel published,
that's right.
James.
He did.
That's true. I did read that character was supposed to be based on Isaac Asimov because of the love of robots.
Oh, right. Right.
And something about the bongos.
I wonder if also they're throwing in another physicist, Richard Feynman, because Feynman was loved playing the bongos.
I don't know. I kind of just sort of took it that he was a beatnik.
Oh.
or had some beatnik tendencies.
Interesting.
Did some drugs, couldn't finish his own sentences. Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah. He does seem to smoke a lot from that pipe.
He
I'll
does.
Just leave it there.
He does. There's a lot of smoking in this episode. Even at one point, Sisko is holding a cigarette, but he's never smoking it.
Actually, does anybody ever? No one actually smokes. Good on you, Deep Space Nine. Everybody's holding cigarettes.
Bashir has the one in his mouth quite a bit, but I'm not sure there's any smoke coming out of that one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's just for effect. That's like the Pink Panther thing.
The Pink Panther thing.
Oh, so you think he doesn't even have a real cigarette in that cigarette holder?
Oh. Okay. Could be. Well, I thought this was a time travel episode.
Oh.
So I was surprised, completely surprised that it wasn't. And maybe a little disappointed because I do like my time travel episodes, but I had no idea that this was a Vision episode.
Yeah, it does look like that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I have questions like, what was actually happening to Benny at the end, do we think? Is the implication that he was having some mental health issues before and hopping between reality and fiction, or did he just snap? Because Sisko implies at the beginning of the episode that he's on the edge of snapping because he was just tired of everything that was going on. But did Benny snap because he was just tired of hiding and hoping that things would get better?
Benny was an analog for Sisko's journey. And they are, in the way the prophets do, reminding him that he needs to stay the path.
Oh.
And that even though it's difficult and stressful, you can't give up.
You can't give up. Even if the struggle seems hopeless, fighting, keeping the fight going, staying strong is ultimately better than succumbing or just saying somebody else needs to handle this or accepting the status quo. Yeah.
I guess that's where it ties in the episode to the civil rights movement of the time.
Right.
Well, then I'm glad we're talking about it because I didn't get that from the story. I didn't get that what he was supposed to get from it was you have to keep trying. It felt like a really hopeless story to me because in the end, he lost his job. His story wasn't going to get published. He seemed to have maybe lost his mind, but he was in an ambulance on the way to where? And in the 50s, being taken to a mental institution is not a good thing. And I imagine it's even worse for somebody who is Black. So it felt really hopeless and terrible to me. And I couldn't understand what the link was to the prophets. What did this have to do with anything? So I'm glad we talked about it. And, maybe we can hear when we get to sort of your personal journey on this, Attiba, maybe there will be more there about what you were getting out of the episode. But I was just like, oh my God, how depressing this poor guy at the end is. Bleak.
Wow.
Yeah, I can see where that came from, and hopefully I can speak to why I actually find this episode to be quite uplifting.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I look forward to that because I did not find it uplifting. I mean, I thought it was good, but I didn't find it uplifting. Okay. My next overanalysis point is we've sort of been talking about how I know you guys can't tell me what the prophets are up to, but what was so strange to me was what interest do the prophets of Bajor have in the racist history and present of Earth? Was this just because it was something specific to Sisko, or why do they care about what's going on Earth?
That's interesting. Have the prophets, I know the prophets have pulled visions from people's individual histories, but have they ever pulled visions from just history?
Interesting.
No, I don't think so. They pull visions from Sisko's history way back in episode 1 of season 1, but I don't think they've rebuilt a history that wasn't Bajor's history before.
But Sisko has some understanding of Earth history. He knew more about past tense of what the Earth was like in that timeline.
True.
So I would expect somebody like Sisko to have an understanding, if you like, of Black history. Maybe the prophets were pulling from his knowledge of that to put him in this situation.
Pulling from something that he at least knew enough about to relate to.
Yes.
Rather than the history of Bajor, which he wouldn't have known as much about, maybe.
Right.
Okay. All right. I didn't think about that.
Contextualizing it for his homeworld.
Okay. I was really fascinated by that idea at the end of the episode about, is this all a dream? And Benny is the real person, and maybe Deep Space Nine is what's being imagined. I mean, in reality, they're all made up, but I like that idea that maybe they were implying that we would get to the end of this show, and maybe we still will, and it'll all be a dream. Maybe this is why they don't bring back Sisko and the other characters onto these shows set in the future, because it's really all a dream, and I'm the only one who doesn't know that.
Oh, interesting take.
We'll have to see.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see. Wow, I talked myself into that hole.
But to the characters involved, what does it matter? It's still their reality.
Oh, yeah, totally. I don't think I have any other over-analysis. So maybe you can talk us through then, Attiba, why this is an uplifting episode. Help me understand.
Okay. For me, it's personally uplifting because I am able to kind of get a macro view of the situation. It's difficult to watch this episode without realizing that it's an episode of television directed by a Black man and with the lead actor as a black man. I keep thinking about the Next Generation episode, The Inner Light, which I think is kind of parallel to this one. But whereas The Inner Light kind of gives you more insight into the character of Picard and really what his feelings are and how he operates on an emotional level. What this episode does is it gives you that kind of, I want to say, meta-analysis of the Star Trek franchise in general. When I view this episode, I see it as showing us where we were, how far we've come, and how far we still have yet to go. And I think it does a phenomenal job of showing just how powerful ideas are. That's generally the theme of the episode, that even though you can throw a person into a mental institution, but the idea is going to get out and still be able to have impact and make waves in the world, even if the person who had the idea is not even around or available to benefit or reap any benefits from that. That's why I find it hopeful, because even though it doesn't in as many words say, and then his stories were great, were a success, right. And like it's kind of sort of implied just by the nature of it being in this show with this. I mean, because James, you were there when DS9 started.
Yes.
Do you recall there being a slight bit of controversy about, well, not controversy, but like it was kind of a big deal that, this is the first black lead character in a Star Trek series. And the same thing would happen again with Voyager.
I remember complaints about why is he only a commander?
In the beginning, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember hearing that specific complaint. Yeah. I do remember feeling that specific complaint. But
I remember hearing about it, about him being, the first black captain or the first black lead. I guess he wasn't the captain at the beginning. I definitely remember hearing about that and probably reading about it because I read a lot of entertainment magazines. But it never came up in any of the conversations that I had in the world because most people I knew were not watching Star Trek. I wasn't even watching the show.
Right.
And there was no social media. So
right.
If the people around you weren't talking about it, then you probably weren't even hearing about it.
We only had Usenet.
Even though there was a lot of racism around me, no one would have brought this up to me on this particular topic because those people weren't watching the show.
Also, another point that I would like to make, following up on what I said about it showing us how far we still have to go. It's still not exactly an easy road for creators of color to get projects over the finish line with protagonists of color. So it shows that even though, we have come quite a long way, this issue is still somewhat pervasive. And, the work continues. And eventually we will get to shine shoes in space. No, that's not what I was saying.
No.
But eventually we will get to space. We won't be shining shoes. And we will all get to benefit from this quasi-utopia that Star Trek pushed forward.
I find it tough when he talked about how, you can't take the idea away from me. You can treat me like I'm not a human, which they were, but you can't kill that idea. And for me, I think what was depressing me about that was, well, actually, they can, and they did a lot at that time, and they still do. And at that time, if the only version of that story was what he was typing up, it's not like he was saving it to a hard drive somewhere. They could easily have burned that and it was gone. And if he had been relegated to a mental institution, you might never hear from him again. I guess my head was going into those dark places. Whereas today, it's much harder to kill an idea that somebody has because they'll just put it on the internet and you can't get rid of it.
It's true, but I'm also always shocked at the number of times in history when ideas get out that sort of advance the popular culture. There's not a lot of reason for us to have, anytime anything gets around the church, anytime anything that kind of clashes with the overarching dominant force of the day, it does happen. Things get out.
It's true.
So you're saying colonialism is bad?
But we could headcanon our way to that by saying maybe this was the thing that finally made Herb quit and go work at Galaxy, and maybe he takes the stories there and gets them published because they're just on pieces of paper in that office. He could have just taken them. He also could have taken them and put his own name on it. I mean, he is Quark, but I guess that's not the point. The point is the character was of color. Yeah.
The character was of color, but also, of course, And yes, that is one of very many different scenarios that could have played out, which could result in the story getting out. We don't really know what happens to Benny after this. I choose to believe that the story got out and eventually he was lauded as a great artist. So
the way of a true great artist, it would be 50 years after his death, he becomes recognized as the greatest writer of a generation. That's usually the tradition.
That's something they could explore or even just hint at one of the current shows that are set farther in the future. They could, like, somebody could just see the name somewhere when they're looking something else up on a console.
I would see Tilly handing someone with a pad with one of Benny's books.
Yeah, see, that would be a super easy thing that they could do.
So yes, that pretty much sums up my feelings about this episode. I think it makes me reflect on the past, it makes me appreciative of the present, and it makes me hopeful for the future.
Cool.
Awesome.
Do you think there was a tie-in here with the way Sisko at the beginning is going to quit? That there's a tie-in to the original show where Nichols...
Uhura?
Nichelle Nichols was going to quit.
Yes.
But Dr. King told her not to.
Oh.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There could be. I mean, I'm sure Avery Brooks is aware of that situation. Most people that are related to Trek know that about that story. I don't know whether it was a direct one-to-one, like he sat down and said, I'm going to intentionally do this, but I'm sure, I mean, I feel like Uhura's shadow kind of looms large over everything here.
Yeah.
So possibly, yeah.
But it's definitely possible that the character of Sisko at this point would be ready to quit. With people he knows keep dying, the war doesn't end, people are trying to just block it out of their mind. You know, it just, in terms of his emotional journey, it makes sense at this point that he would be feeling that way.
So many things I want to say, but I want to not get kicked off the show.
You can come back after and we can talk about it then.
I'm just fascinated that you saw it as a time travel episode.
Well, I only thought it was a time travel episode because I saw the costumes.
Yeah.
And so I just assumed we were going back to Earth history and that we would have to have different costumes. That was it. I didn't know anything else about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in all new territory for me here with this show. I have no idea what's coming or, you know, what each episode is. Oh, I do know one further spoiler yet to come. But beyond that, I don't know anything else.
At what point did you think it was the Prophets?
As soon as Bashir said the synaptic potentials, as soon as he said that, I was like, uh-oh, Here we go.
Now again, I have not seen this episode, but when I rewatched it, when I remembered it, I had always thought that he opened an orb, and that is what triggered, but that is not what happened. And now I'm saying, well, aren't the Prophets responsible for this? Like, do we in fact know that?
Yeah.
Well, in the episode Rapture, he gets hit by some kind of an electrical charge, and that seems to cause this. So my guess is, because he's the emissary, he's always had the potential to be able to have this link to the Prophets. And that physical thing actually connected them. Then Bashir did a medical procedure and he stopped this so that he wouldn't die because they thought he would die. But the Prophets don't care about the medical procedure, so it very easily can just work around that.
Oh, wow. So, do you think that episode where Bashir did the procedure, it didn't do anything? The Prophets just decided to turn it off. The link is permanent. Anytime the Prophets want to talk to him, they'll just turn the communicate with Sisko dial.
I would have said no until this episode. Now I think, yeah.
Huh. That's some good headcanon, Cam.
Thank you.
And is it a two-way communication?
Well, he did yell at them in Sacrifice of the Angels, but he had to be in the wormhole to do it.
He did.
Oh, and he paid a price for that. He's going to get all his permits on Bajor cancelled.
Oh, yeah, he just can't have a house on Bajor.
Really? I'm the emissary of the freaking Prophets. I can't have a
house. Well, we haven't talked about women in the future, and I don't have a lot to say. I definitely like the little reference there to the Kira character using her initials to remove the gender bias, but there really wasn't much else to say about women in the future.
Yeah.
So I guess we go to rating. It seems funny to ask, but thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral. What is your rating? James, you go first.
Absolute thumbs up. Great episode. Really interesting. It touches on reality and it also progresses the story and it develops a really interesting concept of, is Sisko real? Is this just a story? Are they just actors within a writer's mind? I really enjoyed it. It's a good episode. Rewatchability is great. This is one of those episodes you can come back to and rewatch it multiple times. Oh,
yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
Big thumbs up for me. I think this is one of my favorite episodes of Trek, period. This really shows what you can do with not just the franchise of Star Trek, but with the genre of science fiction, how you can use it to commentate on current events in a subtle way and in a not so subtle way sometimes. So, yeah, big thumbs up for me.
It shows how much they can do in just 46 minutes. That's what is so funny about it. I give it a thumbs up as well. It's clearly a meaningful episode with a meaningful message, though I don't know how I feel about it as a Star Trek episode. I would compare it, in my notes, I put that I would compare it to Inner Light, and Attiba mentioned that episode earlier. And that episode people loved, and I've heard a lot of people tell me that that's their favorite episode of TNG, but it was never one of my favorites.
I love it.
I didn't really like it because it took me out of Star Trek. It was something else. It's not that it wasn't good. Yeah. It's just, to me, it wasn't really an episode of TNG. It was an episode of something else. And this is a little bit like that, but at least we have a lot of links here to the prophets and to the story. And, that's obviously what I'm always looking for. So I like this one a lot more than Inner Light, probably because of that connection.
Yeah.
The performances in both are great. The performances from Patrick Stewart in that episode obviously are good, but Avery Brooks in this episode probably even better in his performance.
Yeah.
But I can't deny missing the Star Trek part, and I'd feel confident that my Facebook nemesis is going to be really annoyed that I even said that about this episode, because I'm sure he likes it a lot. And he gets really mad when I say anything negative about these super famous episodes.
I'll back you up. I'm not a huge fan of the Inner Light either.
Yeah, that for me.
What's wrong with you two?
The thing about this episode, what I would compare it to is it's like I stopped reading a novel. I stopped reading the Deep Space Nine novel, and I switched to read a short story. And then I came back to my novel. That's the way that I looked at Inner Light, and that's sort of the way that I look at this episode as well.
Oh.
I don't know if you've ever read the comic book Watchmen, Kim.
I have.
Okay. So this episode is like the pirate parts of Watchmen.
Oh. I did not enjoy that comic. Now we're going to lose more listeners. And then there was the movie, and the movie was god-awful.
No, movie's not great.
But then there was the TV show, which is one of the best TV shows I've ever seen in my life.
I'm with Kim on that one. Loved the Watchmen TV show. Thought it really embraced that crazy world.
Yeah, it was incredible, actually. All right, well, I think we might be done with this episode, so I will thank you for joining us, Attiba.
Always a pleasure.
Do you have anything you would like to mention?
Not plugging anything at the moment, except you can always check out what I am doing at Attiba K on Instagram, Attiba Royster on Facebook, and my website, attibaroyster.com. My podcast, Teebs and Kid Phoenix podcast, is currently on hiatus, but we will be back on the Ides of March 15th, and with some brand new stuff. And that's it for me.
Last season had some absolute gems.
What's the next episode that you'll be joining us for?
It is actually episode 19. It is In the Pale Moonlight, and I cannot wait.
No.
I actually started guesting on this podcast all those years ago just to get to do this episode. It was a long game, but we finally paid off.
Okay. I hope I like it.
You realize you're going to have to come back for season 7. You're not getting out of season 7.
Oh, dear.
All right. I'll pick a particularly egregious episode to come back for.
Pick a bad one. You could have joined us for a couple of bad ones this season, although there have been a lot of good ones. But I think, now I'm mad at both of you that I think about it, that nobody ever mentioned this Klingon wedding to me. I told James he had an opportunity to have a Klingon wedding, and he never told me what it was like.
And she's serious, by the way.
I'm 100%.
It's great.
I would have 100% had that ceremony.
Yeah, it was pretty great.
Yeah. All right. That wraps up season 6, episode 13. Come back next week for episode 14. In the meantime, if you'd like to give us your own overanalysis of this or any episode, or if you just want to say something nice, you can email us at rebingeit@gmail.com or tweet us at rebingeit. We're also on Instagram and YouTube at rebingeit. You can check us out on talkthroughmedia.com, where you can leave feedback for individual episodes, and you can listen to the other podcasts in our network. Rebinge It is also part of a Patreon, patreon.com/Star Trek TTM, which covers all of the Talk Through Media podcasts.
Thanks for joining us on the Rebinge Deep Space Nine podcast.
That's it for me.
And that's it from me.
And that's it for me.